and welcome everyone to this wonderful new video that I'm creating for you. Today we're going to be learning how to paint water over rocks. As usual, I'm going to be starting by sketching just very lightly in with some umber that has been mixed with walnut paint. In this particular workshop, I've really limited the colors that I'm using. Basically, I'm using the raw umber. I use titanium white. I use a very small amount of cobalt blue and a very small amount of cadmium yellow. And as we progress, you'll see how all those colors are used in the workshop. So everyone has your reference image, and as you can see, I'm just right now looking at the rock that's in the center of the image. So at this point, I've grabbed some lighter color. I've mixed some white in with the raw umber, and I'm just very carefully roughing in the rock. At this point, as you know, if you've done other workshops with me, we don't want to get into details at this point. At this point, we're just laying in blocks of color. And when you look at your reference image, you'll see that there are a lot of different little areas of color. Don't worry too much in the beginning about getting all those areas. Just kind of lay out the basics. And then it's a building process. So as we go along, we're going to build on top of that. The brush that I'm using is a medium-sized brush. It's about a number 12 or number 14. And that's a Curry's student brand. I don't use really expensive brushes. I don't feel the need to at this point. I suppose, I mean, I do have a couple brushes that are expensive that I've had for years, and to be honest, I don't really see a whole lot of difference. For me, it's more about learning how to use what I have and not going out and spending lots and lots of money on something and not knowing how to use it. So I'm kind of alternating between the light areas and the dark areas. There's a lot of information when you're looking at this reference image, and our job as an artist is basically to break it down into something that is easier to understand. I'm kind of working my way along the edges of the rock, marking in areas that are dark and areas that are lighter. Again, as I've said before in many of my workshops, there's no right or wrong way of doing this. Every artist has their own way of attacking a new project, and I find myself, I adjust how I do things depending on the project itself, the image that I'm using, or what it is that I want to achieve. So don't be afraid to try new things. Just because you've done something one way in the past doesn't mean you're stuck with doing it that way. Definitely explore and try new things. I mean, if you're going to try new things, certainly when you're doing artwork, that's the time to try new things, because it's not a life-threatening situation, and it really helps build your confidence. It does overflow into daily life when you become efficient and feel more confident in a particular skill. It really does show in your everyday life. Which is one reason why creating artwork is so great for people, especially if they're dealing with mental health issues, or even children who feel very shy and very quiet. Creating art can really help you with your confidence. Now, as you see, I'm varying the brush strokes, and what I'm doing is I'm looking at that rock because it's got a lot of different faces, and I'm brushing the stroke in the direction of that particular plane. So I'm using vertical strokes, I'm using horizontal strokes, I'm going on the diagonal, and all of that will really help show the viewer how that rock is shaped. So taking a really close-up view of this, you can really see how it looks like we've got various planes of the rock going on. And by planes, I mean sides of the rock. A plane, if you remember your geometry back in school, is the side of an object. And as you know, I don't use a pure color when I paint. When I mix, I let the color have streaks through it. For me, that gives a more natural look, because I believe that there are no solid colors in real life, that everything that we see is made up of a variety of different shades. And so I like to simulate that by, when I mix my paints, not insisting on a solid color. At this point, we're going to fast forward a little bit. I try to not let these videos go on too long. So some portions I do fast forward through, especially if there's a lot of repetition. As you can see, we've got a very basic formation down of the rock. We're going to go back in later and add in more depth. Moving on now, we're going to try putting in some of the dark areas of the water. If you look carefully at your reference image, there are some darker areas off to the right of that rock face. And this rock is a rock that is in the rapids of a river that I walk past quite frequently. I haven't done so much this past summer, but in years past, it's the Sydenham River. And if you walk it, there are areas that have rapids, so it's quite interesting, and I've taken lots of photographs that I use periodically with my work. I'm just adding more of the darkest darks that I can see. And as you know, when I do the water, I try to use a horizontal stroke for the most part. It just kind of shows the flatness of the water. And all I'm using right now is the raw umber mixed with a bit of white. I haven't added any other colors in there. Now I'm shifting over, and now that I've done the darkest darks, I'm going to add in some of the areas where I think the lightest lights are. It's nice to be able to identify the contrasts in an image or in a scene that you're sitting in front of. It kind of gives you a gauge for the rest of the composition as you're going through. And again, if you watch carefully the brushwork, it's very kind of random. I'm just sort of thinking in my mind, I tend to, when I'm working, I tend to imagine myself at the scene, live, sitting there or standing there, watching the water flowing over the rock. I'm imagining what it sounds like, I'm imagining what it feels like, and then I'm translating those emotions through my brush, and that's affecting how I hold the brush and how I move the brush. So I'm sort of imitating, I suppose, the water itself. I know it's probably an unusual way to approach something, but it's an approach that really seems to work for me. I kind of imagine myself being there in the scene. And if you've ever seen any of my work, it's the type of work where I put the viewer right in the scene rather than you looking out a window. You're actually in that scene. So again, we're just very roughly blocking in. We're still blocking in, even though it looks like we've got some shapes going. We're blocking in areas. And at this point, I'm using the white, and I've added a teeny little bit of the brown, of your raw umber. And in some places I've added a teeny little bit of the blue. And I keep saying teeny because, as you know, when you're mixing these dark colors, especially if you're using oils into your whites, the color is very, very powerful and it mixes very dark very quickly. So always start off when you're mixing with a tiny little dot on your brush, and you can always work in darker at that point. So here we're working on that swirling water that got caught in between that little crevice in the rock and that sort of U shape. If you've ever watched rapids, when it comes down, the water flows, but then sometimes it does actually make a turn and it bashes up against itself and it floats up over the rock. Just some pretty interesting things. Had a little bit of trouble with this setup. I should have put this on my usual. I usually use a black setup board in behind that I tape my board onto so it's more secure, so it's not bouncing around as I'm trying to paint on it. That's definitely something that is handy to do if you're using canvas paper like I am in this video. Tape it down to something that's more secure and solid, so it's not bouncing around on you when you're trying to paint. So at this point I haven't changed brushes. I'm still using that same brush that we started with in the beginning. Now I'm going back to the rock. And I'm going to mark in, I've mixed in the brown, and I've mixed in some blue with that brown, and I've actually mixed in the darker blue. I like to use Prussian blue as my darkest blue. Certainly you can use whatever it is that you've got on hand. And if you don't have that, then use your regular, you could use cobalt blue, but also add to darken it down even further, add some red and a bit of yellow. If you mix all the primaries, you can get black. So if you want something that's dark, mix your black and add a bit of brown to it, and it'll give you a dark brown. As you can see, I'm just kind of really roughly dotting in those dark areas. And those dark areas are actually going to be behind the water. So it's important to get those in first, because their water is going to lay over top of it. And most of the water that lays over top of the dark is that foamy water that kind of froths up and splashes up as the water flows over the rock. And that's where our nice high contrast area and our focal point will be developed. Anywhere that you have your darkest darks and your lightest lights side by side, automatically the viewer's eye is attracted to that area, and that becomes your focal point of your composition. And we're continuing to develop those dark areas, adding in now over top of the brown that I put in before some of that darker color that I had mixed up. Just dotting it through. So at this point I'm going back to the water and I'm marking in some of the contours that I can see. The water is sort of heaving and like a roller coaster, I suppose. It's sort of lifting and falling, swirling, just sort of adding in areas of color. I'm also taking my time at this point, and I'm adding in a few brush strokes, and I'm stepping back, taking a look, and adding a couple more. This one was a little bit of a different approach. It's a little bit more impressionistic, I suppose. And I'm not actually mixing colors side by side. I'm just laying colors side by side. And when the viewer looks at it, your eye will naturally blend those colors. So as you've noticed, I've got my background pink again. I've achieved that by mixing a little bit of red in with my gesso. And I like to use gesso now pretty much with every surface that I'm using to paint on, whether it's a wood panel or a canvas panel or a stretched canvas, or in this case it's canvas paper. I like the smoother texture rather than the rough texture of the canvas. It's just a personal preference. And when I apply the gesso, I don't actually worry about sanding it down and making it super smooth. I know some artists will go through all those lengths. I actually use a very big coarse brush. It's actually the brush that you would use if you're painting your wall. And I allow the brush strokes to come through, So when it's dry, if you look at any of my gessoed panels or whatever, you'll see a texture that's been left behind, and that texture will be behind the painting itself. So it's kind of interesting. If you ever look really closely at any of my work, it's just something I've started doing and just really enjoy having. It's just, for me, it just adds that extra dimension to the work. So at this point I'm going through, and now that we've got the darks in the water, and now I'm adding the lighter areas, and I've taken my titanium white and mixed a little bit of my cadmium yellow in, and we're just kind of going through, and these areas that I'm marking in are areas that I identify as being more flat, where the water is on the surface of the water and it's not springing up. So I'm just putting in those flatter areas first, and then the water that's sort of dancing on the top will add in over top as we go along. And I'm allowing some of that pink surface to come through, so I'm not covering it entirely, and my paint is not completely opaque so that you can't see what's below. It is a little bit transparent, and so you're getting that slight pinky tinge, which is almost making the water glow as if it's glowing in the sun. And certainly if you wanted to try something different than putting a pink in the background, you could do that. You could do a red, which would make it very, very vibrant. You could do a very brilliant yellow, and that would liven up the entire picture as well. I would find that having a white surface, just your pure white background on this kind of a composition, would be difficult, because as you're adding in your white paint, you're not actually going to be able to see it, because there's going to be no contrast between the surface you're painting on and the paint that you're applying. So as usual, I encourage you to try different things in your work. It's when you discover those happy accidents, as Bob Ross says. Now, even though this image is sort of a detail of a water's surface rather than like a vista view, there is still, if you look at your image that you have, there is still, you can see that that water at the top of the image, which is further away from the viewer, is still lighter than everything that is down below, which is closer to the viewer. And what that does, when you make things that are further away lighter and things that are closer darker, it helps to show the depth of that painting, of that composition. I'm starting to add in a little bit of cobalt blue in places. I find with this image, it has little hints of blue, and basically the blue is the reflection of the sky. But overall, because the rocks are underneath, the rock's color of that sort of brownish, darkish, bracky color is coming through, and that's more what you're seeing in the reflection of the water than you are of the sky itself. Of course, as always, if your preference is to show more blue in your water, you can certainly do that. I challenge you, next time you're out walking and you're walking along a creek or a river, take a look at the water and really look at that water. And you'll probably notice that the water is not actually blue. The water is picking up the color, it's reflecting the color that's all around it, from the trees, from the grass, from the leaves. The only time water looks truly blue is when it's reflecting the sky. So here I'm doing something that I don't often show in my videos. A lot of times I find that holding that palette all the time or having it off to the side, it's a little bit inconvenient, especially when I want to add things in very lightly. And so I have a larger palette knife that I'll mix a color onto, and then the smaller one I'm kind of dabbing in, and I'm just dabbing that color onto the canvas. And that's how I'm getting that splash effect. I'm just basically dabbing it. I'm putting it very thick. There's a very thick glob of paint underneath that palette knife, and I'm just basically touching and pulling that paint along. Takes a little bit of practice. If you've never done it before, take a clean sheet and try it on that, or try it on parchment paper, and then you can always scrape the paint off later, just to kind of get that dotty, free looking effect. Certainly if you're more comfortable using brushes, you could use a brush, in which case I would recommend using what I always call the magic tree brush, which is your fan brush. And the same idea, putting a fairly thick coating of paint onto that brush, on the ends of the brush, and just sort of dabbing it in and touching the canvas and pulling it across very lightly. So as you can see, we've added in a fair bit of texture, and it's important to leave this stage of texture towards the very end of your painting. At the beginning, we kind of laid down those different colors that we see the transparent sort of water, the rocks. Anything that's texture is going to be more forward to the viewer. And of course, when you follow the thick over thin rule, you want the thicker paint to be on top of thinner paint when you're doing oil. At this point, I put down the palette knife and I'm going back in with a brush, and I'm just softening some of those areas where the thick paint is touching the transparent layer underneath. I'm not going to do this for every area. I'm just going to go in where I think that there's a bit of a blurry edge, and that's basically what I'm doing. Blurring the edge. And again, like I said, at this point as well, you want to step back and take a look at the work. We've added a little bit of yellow. And that just will add a little bit of a highlight. And when you're smoothing the edges and you're sort of doing that blurring effect, it gives you the effect of how the water will sort of condense into such tiny little droplets. It creates almost a mist. Now if you look there on the right of this part of the rock, I have introduced some cobalt blue into that water. And that just gives us a nice cool color to contrast with the warm color that we find on the rock. Because as I mentioned earlier, that little area with the dark areas and the light areas side by side, I want to contrast it, and another nice way to add contrast is to put a warm color beside a cool color, and that just increases the contrast in the composition. Just working on the edges of the rock that are furthest away, I want to blur those a little bit, so I'm just using a dry brush and I'm just softening those edges. Of course, if you're using oil paint, those edges are still going to be wet, so you'll be able to do that. And go in and soften the edge. And that just makes that rock, that far edge of the rock, further into the background. Of course, the edges that are closer to us, to the viewer, we want to keep those sharper, more in focus, with more detail. Things that are farther away are blurrier, lighter in color, smaller, and less detail. So I picked up a small flat brush at this point because I just want to dot in really carefully a couple of those little splashes that are sort of floating as if they're They're just frozen in time above that rock. So again, because I'm putting it on top of other layers, the paint is very thick. I'm just kind of dotting it in. Got some yellow on the brush now. Just adding in a few areas that I want the sun to be reflecting. And as you get closer and closer, you want to slow down. Add a couple strokes, stand back, take a look. At this point I'm pretty happy with what I have, and I'm ready to put my signature on. I hope you enjoyed the video and the workshop. As always, if you have any questions, please send me an email and I will help you out with your work. Thanks for watching.